Welcome to the Workspace of Tomorrow podcast, brought to you by Room, the New York City startup rethinking the modern workspace, in partnership with The Slowdown. I'm your host, Spencer Bailey. Here, I speak with creative leaders who have had a front row seat to observe the transformational shifts in how we're all working today, and have deep insight into where things are headed. Hey everyone. If you're listening to this, you're probably thinking the same thing I am. What's the future of the workspace? How are technology and design reshaping not just how we work, but where and when we work? Where is it all headed? We'll be finding the answer to these and many other questions through each episode of this podcast. First up, David Rockwell, an architect and designer who is the founder and president of the cross-disciplinary practice Rockwell Group. Known especially for his innovation in hospitality design, as well as for his set design work for Broadway shows, Rockwell brings a passion for performance and play to everything he touches. His projects range from luxury hotels and high-end restaurants to large-scale offices and furniture designs. In our conversation, we got deep into the importance of rituals and the value of making memorable experiences in the workspace, the role of choreography as a means to understanding how people work, and the need for, as Rockwell put it to me, quote, turbocharging variety into the office experience. My favorite part of the conversation came when we got into what he sees as the most overlooked element of the workspace, the ceiling. I don't want to reveal too much, so let's jump in and hear straight from him. This is my conversation with David Rockwell. So David, welcome. It's great to have you in the studio here today.
Great to be here.
I wanted to start with your own personal approach, how you look at the world. It's really about architectural rigor, performance, this element of theater. How do you think about your design work as a means to improve culture, both in and out of the office in your projects?
That's a good question. So I had an interesting discussion recently with Danny Meyer. I'm working on a book right now on the relationship of theater and architecture. I was having a discussion about rituals and memory. And I think so much of what creates sort of memorable, rich experiences are, yes, they're all the things the architects deal with having to do with permanence, but they're all of the many, many conditions that have much more to do with evolution and change and serendipity. I asked him, we were there in the morning and they were just setting up the restaurant. And he said he can tell, he has a sense in the morning with how people are setting up the table, with how the day is going to be, the intentionality of how they're doing that. And it made me think about one of the things I'm studying is in theater. Think about the year and a half or 2 years and the 30 professionals who worked on that 2-hour moment where the theater is alive. Right, so you're getting a 2.5 hour, if it's a long 2-hour experience that will create memories that may last your lifetime, that involved years of people collaborating to make that happen. So I think that is one of the things I've discovered that I love doing in public space. It's the New York I fell in love with when I was 12 really wasn't skyscrapers. It was much more sort of messy streetscapes. And
yeah. And one element of your work that's so central is the notion of play.
Yeah.
Your project, probably most notable in this arena, is Imagination Playground.
Yeah.
Could you talk about the value of play and how you create spaces with that in mind?
Well, I got to go back to, everything looks different in the rearview mirror. But when we started the playground, which grew out of a post 9/11 effort that originally was the viewing platform at Ground Zero with Liz Diller, Rick Scofidio, and an architect named Kevin Kennan. And we set up a foundation to do that. And after that was complete, one of the people who had given money for the foundation said, "What's your foundation going to do next?" And I said, that was it. It was a kind of a one-shot foundation. And he said, "Why don't you discover something else to do?" So I spent about a year looking at building a new art center on Fulton Street that was visual and performing arts together. As I got into it, I realized the uphill battle of city, state, every agency. And at a moment of frustration, I'd been looking at Pier 26 where my kids used to play, and I said I should have just given the city a playground. And that began a couple years of research. And I went back to thinking about how in my particular case, as a kid moving around a lot, I lost my dad at a very young age. We moved from Chicago to the Jersey Shore, moved around there, and then moved to Mexico when I was 12.
Right, Guadalajara.
Yeah. Which was like a godsend. It was such a great move. I didn't know it at the time. But play in every facet of building and having the physical world be an ongoing thing you're invested in is a way to connect with people was sort of a life-saving, galvanizing experience for me. And it's clearly what drove my interest when we got to Mexico is my interest moved beyond theater to sort of street theater and marketplaces. And so when I started looking at playgrounds, it was interesting to note how much of the great play equipment all over the city was based on linear play versus collaborative group play. And we did what we do with every project. We did a lot of research. I've got to say, Adrian Benepe, who's one of my all-time heroes, he was the commissioner of parks. I called him up and I said, I have this new idea for a playground. He said, great. And it was 5 years of R&D and research. And our first play date, we had test play dates with kids. It was public schools and private schools. The city helped put it together. And the whole theory was kids would make up their own rules to play, and they would take these various blocks and create things together. So we had a woman named Penny Wilson, who is from London. She's like the Mary Poppins of adventure playgrounds in London, came over to be part of our play date. All the adults surrounded. The kids came out, and they looked at the pieces. And the first thing they did is the boys started whacking each other with the noodles. And you could just see the parents were so ready to jump in and organize it. And we waited a minute or two. They stopped doing that, and kids started building towers individually. Another 5 or 10 minutes, you could see one kid would look at someone else's tower and say, how do I connect that to my tower? So it went from like aggression to individual play to group play in a way that was not unlike what we want to have happen at Neuhaus. You know, when companies come in, they can move from aggression to collaborative play.
Wow. Yeah, I love that. I mean, and connected to this, of course, is the idea of like creating spaces with narrative and purpose. And you're known for your books, the titles of which I think are, sum up your work nicely. So What If, which came out in 2014, Spectacle from 2006, and Pleasure from 2002.
Yeah.
The notion of what if, spectacle, pleasure, these sort of narratives, how do you weave those into your design work?
Well, you can draw the analogy of when we're working on we just finished Warner Music's new headquarters in LA, Warner Music Group. And in terms of how we constructed a narrative, well, part of the narrative was the building. It was this 1930s Ford factory that was built as a kind of tribute to American manufacturing. And there was clearly an overlap between that and Warner. And then the biggest challenge was the key to the solution, and that is there were 6 different labels, each with a very different culture. I think it's safe to assume many didn't want to be in the same building as the others. These, they were part of Warner Music Group, but these are competitive labels. So we had to create a way that they could live with their own individual cultures. But then, much like a park in a city, we created a couple of seductive draws, including Center Stage, which is a tiered lobby that becomes a 250-seat venue that any of the labels can use. And the cafeteria doubles as their version of co-working. It's called the living room. And like anything, we found pockets of incredible inspiration that you have to look at the intersection of different ideas to find. So that was very difficult and involved, pushing and pulling till you found that right narrative. I think where most people get confused, I think, when I talk about narrative to them, is that it's not like that narrative needs to be legible in the result. The fact that the original Nobu was based on Japanese landscape and involved Peruvian street foods and Japanese food in terms of color, or that there was a sense of ritual that was at the center of it, doesn't need to be legible. It just gives you the foundation.
Yeah, it just is.
It just is.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is something many people doing restaurants will not acknowledge. Nothing makes a design look better than really great food.
Well, on the subject of hospitality, I wanted to kind of connect this to the workspace because, as you mentioned, you've designed several Nobus. You designed the Equinox Hotel at Hudson Yards in New York that just opened, the Virgin Hotel in Chicago, the Cosmopolitan in Las Vegas, the master plan and renovation of the Taj Mahal Palace and Tower Hotel in Mumbai. Many, many projects. In terms of taking learnings from those and bringing them into your workspace projects, which have included the Warner Music Office, WME-IMG, Neue House, where's the sort of correlation or the translation, the conversation between the two?
Well, I think there's so many interesting layers to studying hospitality. One unexpected thing is if you think about a restaurant environment, a hotel that has a sense of welcome, that morphs and changes throughout the day. The JetBlue terminal at JFK that we worked on with JetBlue, has a very different sense of welcoming if you're leaving the city or arriving into the city. So we try to look at how that might be layered and how that applies to, say, Union Square Cafe or a restaurant you might be familiar with, Nobu downtown, it's really a choreographed series of spaces. So if you're the first 10 people, the first 2 people that come into a restaurant, the sense of hospitality is going to be different because you're entering an empty restaurant. So I think choreography is one of the key ways to create a kind of evolving sense of hospitality. Another thing I've discovered in the workspace, and a lot of it grows out of the work we're doing with Knoll, where we did an extensive line of products, and we're now extending that and working with them, is so much of what happens that's meaningful in a workspace is what happens in between doing other things, on the way to doing other things. It's not the planned meetings or the individual workstations.
Yeah. That's why you called the series Unscripted.
That's right.
I'm guessing.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's all light enough to move. So how does that, there's a clear hospitality underpinning to being able to reconfigure the room. Working in hospitality has been an incredible teacher for me about lighting, what works during the day, what works at night, what creates enough focus to feel like you're got an intimate workspace, but you're connected to other people. I also think as the workspace has evolved, more and more, you don't need to be at work to do your work. So you're not coming to work, you're not getting the madman cubicle. You're not necessarily getting the big, huge, swivelly chair. So you're coming for other things. And I think that's where a sense of hospitality, surprise, a lot of the things I'm interested in happen to be on wheels. So whether it's small things or big things, I think drink carts are the beginning of an evolution we're going to see in breaking down the scale of restaurants. At Neue House, my favorite part of the food and beverage isn't the cafe, it's those carts that go around.
Yeah. Which connects so much to your theater work, this idea of movement, adaptability, transformation. You, of course, had early exposure to theater, which has had a long impact on your work. You've done set designs for Lucky Guy, Kinky Boots, Hairspray, Rocky Horror Picture Show. You've designed theaters themselves.
And then I've done sets in the theaters I've designed.
Yeah.
And when you do that, you can't come in and go, boy, this theater is crap. Who designed that? You got to be nice to the theater.
Well, how has all that work, on Broadway and off Broadway informed how you think about the workspace?
Well, it's deepened my belief that in the workspace, one of the goals is to put a disproportionate amount of effort and time into those things that people share. And the Knoll Unscripted is about 30 products. The first product, the very first thing we presented them, is a freestanding wall system that has a series of sliding screens. So it can be the wall you sketch on and you create on or present on. And it grew out of an experience I observed designing McCann Erickson's headquarters, where we sat in on a presentation that they were doing to a client. My observation was the work they developed and the working on it was so much more interesting than the final product. I think process is so much more interesting in many cases than final product, that in Workspace, we try to double down on those things that are shared and that create a sense of process. And this wall system became one of the keys to a whole line of products that are overtly like a proscenium. In the theater, you're when the curtain goes up, you find out new rules about whatever story is being told. I think Workspace works that way too, and it's one of the things transitions and portals provide, which is a sense of movement and sequence. I also think one of the things we were able to do at Neuhaus and at Warner Music and at WME, it's 3 examples, is the heart of those spaces. Actually, at William Morris, it's called the Heart. It has an open kitchen that can be used when they have visiting chefs, or it can be used for a staff meal. It can be subdivided. There's a flexible heart at the center of it that in some ways is engaging and kind of like what a hearth provides in a home. It attracts that energy. And, the same thing at Neuhaus with the stairs and the light fixtures that lower at night that let you know there's a change in the day.
Yeah. I'm curious because you're designing so much for process, really. Like you're creating products that are fixed or maybe on wheels and movable, but at the end of the day, it's about facilitating process. Obviously, sometimes that must turn out differently than the designer expects. I'm curious, like how if there's ever been a moment in Neuhaus or some of your projects where something maybe turned out differently than you thought, positively or negatively.
Yeah, well, there's always those things. And what's really incredible is when a client gives you the opportunity to have a relationship and it's not just transactional. So there's a chance to grow over time and learn and understand. And I'll give you another great theater example. Very, very smart theater director named Jack O'Brien and Jerry Mitchell, who choreographed Hairspray, which was my second Broadway show. We went out of town in Seattle. And there was no set for the end of the play because they said, why don't we see what the play is before we create the set? Which is something I'd never thought about, which is don't do all the designing till you know what the purpose is. And we found that in every one of the examples, Warner Music doesn't resemble at all what we started out doing. And part of what we had to recognize is in order for these individual cultures to be individual, they had to generate some of the work. So we had to leave unfinished spaces. And I think unfinished is a really beautiful thing that a lot of people are afraid of, that then lets you finish.
Adapt to change or, yeah.
I've had places I go back to where you go, well, what the hell are these people doing? But it's their place then.
Yeah, I think the idea of like a workspace as a blank canvas is a really nice one. Even if much of the space is activated and busy, to leave a corner or a pocket or
also things that create a sense of local intimacy. We just did a line of furniture for Benchmark out of London, and they're the most beautiful craftsmanship you can imagine. And there's a sofa love seat with a high wood back that when they're sort of back to back performs one of the things we're seeing office spaces need more and more, which is sort of offline place to have a conversation without a lot of distractions that isn't a cubicle. So something in between a furniture and a wall.
I like that. I guess connected to that, I wanted to talk about co-working, open office, and sort of design's ability to get people to interact, to connect, which is such a focal point of your work.
Yeah.
Well, what are your thoughts on co-working in general?
What's most interesting about it is the variety of sort of cultural languages. I think there was a period in which co-working had a sort of frat house, beanbag chair vernacular, which fortunately seems to be waning. But I think it accommodates so many different cultures. One of the things about co-working I find most intriguing is how that changes throughout the day. We think about what would be the shared spaces, whether it's a kitchenette or a conference room or desks that are changeable. I also personally feel like there's a tendency to think flexibility means neutrality, which I don't think it does. I think abdicating any sense of there's no point of view. You can't take a design that's so neutralized that it has no point of view. So I think having some personality that expresses what the culture of that place is, that's changeable, is sort of the future of co-working. And also I think there have to be attractors that make it worth leaving home if you can do your work at home. We were working on a project in Las Vegas, a nightclub, and everyone wanted a cabana, and everyone wanted a private table. And one of the owners said, "Well, if they wanted to be that private, they would just stay in their room. That you're coming out actually for some connection." So in co-working, that's one of the interesting challenges. How do you create the conditions for enough privacy to do your work, be able to connect with different people, and then sort of congregate?
Yeah. I guess in terms of where you see all this going, what are some trends or sort of bold ideas you have?
Bold ideas, God. I think turbocharging variety. I think that part of that is making it more porous. You're already seeing hotels that, by definition and how they're laid out, become workspaces, like the lobby of the Ace Hotel is an example lots of people point to. But I think variety and allowing other people in and out, using co-working as a way to launch products, test products, instead of having one embedded food partner bring multiple food partners in. Actually develop a strategy for desks and spaces that can open up in the evening and create a kind of bigger entertaining spaces that breathe and have the variety of the way we want to live our lives. It feels like a big idea that's already on its way to happening.
Mm-hmm. Is there something you've always wanted to do in workspace design that you have yet to do, or something that you feel like would be the kind of thing that you would dream of doing, I suppose?
Yeah, I don't know that I want to actually impose this on the world necessarily, but one of the things that's intriguing to me is using the ceiling more and thinking about sort of theatrical rigging and having a very, very open space. And what's changeable is things that come up and down. So, as I mentioned in my house, the light fixtures come up and down on manual counter rigs. And I think fly lofts in theater spaces, whenever I'm with a group of architects touring a theater, the fly loft is the most surprising place because it's pure potential. So I've always wanted to create an office space where, like Get Smart in the Cone of Silence for anyone over 55 years old. The idea that you can actually use that ceiling space to have multiple worlds nested and come down. Walls, conference rooms, welcome centers.
Yeah, it's funny, the ceiling tends to be one of these things we forget, and lighting too. It's actually usually a good thing when you forget the lighting.
Ceiling is often ignored. We did the Children's Hospital at Montefiore that opened in 2002 and spent several years studying children's hospitals. And one of the things we discovered is the ceiling is the surface the kids look at the most, because most of the time they're horizontal and it's a totally unexplored surface in terms of wayfinding. But I think the more I think about it, I think an office space as black box theater, so that the play of the workspace evolves throughout the day. You'd need to have some tech staff there, but that would be awesome too. Everyone has tech staff anyway, but instead of just deciphering how to make your phone work, they could transform the space.
This is great. Thanks, David. Thanks for coming in today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more on the podcast, head to theworkspaceoftomorrow.com. You can follow Room on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Made by Room. And be sure to visit room.com to learn more about how the New York City startup is reimagining the modern workspace. We'll be back with our next episode in a couple of weeks. Stay tuned.